All right, so name and age.
My name is Dan Ward, and I am 74 years old.
So Dan, tell me how you got into the timber industry.
Well, I worked for the Forest Service between after high school and between college years. I was going to stay on there and go to school and become I guess it would be gone. I lost her already.
Forester?
Yeah, well, no, I was going to be on the engineering crew,
Oh yeah.
surveying crew, and
Mm-hmm.
we got into December, and there was a slump in the logging industry. The timber cruising unit didn't cruise any more timber, so we had no more roads to build
Mm-hmm.
and no more work to do. So about December, just about Christmas time, I was out of work. And I had a couple little twin daughters at that time, Donna and Chris, and anyway, a job opened up. A friend of mine, Les Allen, said, "Hey, maybe you can go to work for us. We need a whistle pump." We didn't even have talkie tutors back in the day. And I said, "Whatever." And it was right. Wintertime, I remember the cold wind coming off the straits, and it was up in Gardner, right above the tribe's longhouse deli,
Wow.
building the fire, even with the fire, and watching what was going on, whistle pumping, dragging cords around the woods. It was interesting, and I was young and pretty good shape, but to stay warm in that situation, and every once in a while, I remember older Joe McCone. He was a hook tender, and when we got there, they just finished another unit, and this unit was probably 2/3 cut. We got there, and they brought the tree down. They had a big, heavy spar tree at that time. They drug it down to the landing, and we dug a hole. I think he had a HD 20, Ellis Chalmers 20, and he dug a hole, and we got the stick of wood in there and had it, some of it rigged up on top, and we started pulling it with that and with the yarder. It was an old yarder on skids, and it had I don't know if it had a gas pot or a diesel engine.
Wow.
even at that time. And I remember a guy by the name of Zaccardo. He was running it, and there's a road up there in Blinn named after him, Zaccardo Road. But he was running the yarder, and we grunted and pulled and got it up there. And I remember Joe climbed it, and when he went up there, he dropped the rope down, and we were able to pull the hay wire up through it, and on a little block we had hooked on it, and then things started going up and down on the block as he was slipping and sliding and rigging it. And when it came time, all of us had a chance to ride up to the top of the tree and back. I chose not to.
Yeah, okay.
I figured when I was a kid, I climbed every tree there was around. Never fell out of any. Came close, but they were slip sliding around. And the last guy that went up, I can't remember who it was, went up, and there was a hitch in the hay wire, and it jumped up and bounced back down. I remember Bob Allen said, "Hey, do you want to ride up there?" And I said, "No, I don't think I lost anything there." And in my mind, I thought from now on, when I get a chance, I'm going to go to the top of the trees with a tape, and I'm going to, as they're laying on the ground, I'm going to cut them off that way.
Yeah,
I'm not
okay.
going to go up and down. It just didn't interest me. It wasn't so much I was afraid of heights. What I was kind of afraid of was I could get used to heights. And after a while, you lose your fear. And I didn't think that was a place to lose your fear, up the top of a tree.
Wow.
And anyway, I remember Joe was cold. It's hard to keep warm out there, and he was a skinny little guy. He'd come over by the fire and get warm, and I'd go set chokers, which I was glad to do anything besides stand by that fire. And I think there was a little trouble over that, and I didn't get in trouble, but I think he did at the time. And anyway, I ended up setting chokers, me and another guy, and the other guy, he had another job he went to when it got towards the spring. We were logging uphill at the time. A guy got hurt. There was a little tree, maybe 8-10 inches around that didn't get bucked off the roots. It was a windfall laying there, and one of the logging downhill, one of the logs caught it and swung it around downhill. Well, the guy was setting chokers wasn't quite out of the way of that. He was out of the way of the turn, but not that when I picked it up. I blew the whistle. As soon as I saw it pick it up, I blew the whistle, but he was down below it, and it went bounce, bounce, and he was in a hole, and it knocked him right down and pinned him to the ground and bounced right on over him.
Oh, wow.
And he was laying there kicking, and I thought he was dead, and I knew nothing but to hold the whistle down until something stopped. And Bob Allen was in the landing pushed the landing out with the cat, and he finally stopped and got out and said, "What?" I said, "He got hurt. A log hit him to get over and see how he's doing." Well, I couldn't blow the whistle to stop things and get over to where he was at. But I had kind of a funny fear in me as he was laying there kicking. I'd hunted enough, and I saw it didn't kill him, but I think it busted a couple of his backbones,
Oh, wow.
wings off his backbones, and it busted his stomach. And as far as I know, he never logged again.
Wow.
And yeah, it was and right then I should have known better than to keep logging. I should have said,
Wow.
can you give me what little you owe me? I'll go find something to do. But anyway, it was still winter time, and then later on I was setting chokers, and we got logging below the road, and we were able to slack line. We put the cat down at the tail hold, and we were able to move it. It was kind of a wet back, and some of us had to be careful. We moved it from one setting to the other. I kind of enjoyed the slack line. But we first started doing that, we just still had whistles. We had the fire and the whistles by the fire, and we could run out and take turns running out, and the other one would run out, because we had to be by the whistle. And here this airplane came flying over, dropping a bunch of leaflets in the air. I had no idea what it was all about, and come to find out it was Finley Hayes advertising. He was selling talkie tutors. He was advertising talkie tutors. As I told you, I had met him years later, but we finally got talkie tutors, and they were pretty good. Two guys could set chokers, and you each had a talkie tutor, or one of them out there had it. I think we each had one, and the best thing we had a lot of fun because we could talk on it.
Oh, yeah.
To the landing, they couldn't talk back.
Oh.
So, being pretty young and a couple of guys out there kind of smart aleck, you know, and we could
Really have some fun.
yeah, we had a good time. But anyway, yeah, we set chokers, and I set chokers there until Les's brother, Bob's son, got out of high school. That must have been in May or June.
Okay.
And then he came out there, and so I was out of a job at that time. And I think Wally Peterson was getting ready to cutting some cants. In fact, right there around Hanson's Pond,
Okay.
right behind where the church is. I pastor, and anyway, I asked him. He said, "Yeah." And of course, I knew Wally. Grew up, you know, he was older than me, but grew up around him. So I started running the log haul, pulling the logs in and cutting the lengths, making cants there, and had an old flathead V8 Ford engine in it in the log haul.
Wow.
And the line went out, and you had a saw. It was a good setup, but kind of crude. The saw was about probably 4 or 5 feet long, maybe, and it had something you had to grease it once in a while, but it had a handle, and a shaft went through the handle, and you had a big handle sticking out the side. You grab it, have the saw going, and you grab it and just lean against it, cut it off, lean it against it and cut it off.
Wow.
So you'd bring one piece at a time in. If you looked out there and thought there was going to be 3 12-footers up to 6 inches or so, you just 12-footers or 8-footers, whatever you had, to 16-footers or whatever. And I think we got about a truck and trailer load of cants cut a day. And
Really?
yeah, and I think Marvin Ackerman at the time, he hauled them. Most of the time he hauled them, but you had it set up so when the stack of cans were ready, you know, then you move them out of the way. The next one was ready. You take them and you could push them off there onto the,
Okay.
drop the stake and push them onto the truck, the front and then the back, and put
Okay.
some wrappers around it and hauled them to Delson down in Olympia.
Was Walt driving for, I mean, was Marvin Holland for Walt Kelly? Or driving for him, I mean?
You know, earlier on he was, and maybe later, but Marvin bought his own truck. He had his own truck.
Okay.
And I can't remember, it was a kind of blue and white Kenworth or Peterbilt maybe, I don't know. But anyway, he's a good truck driver. Nice guy, good mechanic. I don't know what Ackerman is, a good mechanic.
Yeah, I'd say you're right there.
But anyway, yeah, he was good to be around. But yeah, he hauled the cans. He probably got about a load a day down to Olympia.
Wow.
And
how long were you doing the camp work for Wally?
I think we had 30 some acres there around Hanson's Pond.
Okay.
And we cut them a lot of times. You'll see at that time, I think Gary Middleton was running. He had an old Model D mountain logger.
Mm-hmm.
And I could change an O-ring on the front of that thing in no time. You changed them, so I don't know why. We had a handful of O-rings if you were running it, or well, you take the front plate off. It had the plate and little holes all over it. Pop that off, change the O-ring on it for the steering and everything else that ran through the power.
Wow.
And it just happened to be the way they were.
Wow.
But anyway, he was running the mountain logger, and he'd stack them up there, and he'd pull the logs out and cut them up. And you know, it all took time, but it was interesting. In fact, that was the second job. The first job was in Coyle.
Okay.
We're cutting cants out in Coyle on some more of the Worthington's property. Bob Worthington or Norman, I don't know whose it was, but it's probably a 40 or 80 acre piece. We cut a lot of them out there, and I was stacking the cants. And that was kind of fun. Wow. And Wally was good to work for, because if you looked, needed a 1-inch 2x6 or whatever, and you know, to fill a hole up. You didn't have to fill every hole up, but why not if you could? And I just, you know, usually the left one little finger left is a 1x6, and hold it up, and when you got a chance, the log was big enough, 1x6, you'd fill it up, and you'd already have the other part going, and when you topped it off, it was a square deal, you know, full of wood. And I didn't mind doing that. Run the old pickaroon and pull logs and stuff. And I think a guy by the name of Fred Abeta, old boy that worked for Wally quite a bit in the cants, he ran the log haul. And another guy, at that time, another guy was cutting, and his nephew ran the slabs, through the slabs, and sent, you know, the green chain. And Wally's dad ran Wally's D6 Cat, and with an arch behind it, and he hooked up the logs, brought the logs
Really?
in. Yeah, Walt was pretty old at that time, but brought the logs in. I remember going out there, getting a little behind and getting the logs in there, and going out and helping Walt. He'd turn around and have some more places, and we'd hook logs and send them in. He'd come back and we'd hook them and send them in and get caught back up, and then he'd keep up. And that was an interesting. That was the summertime by that time.
Okay.
Pretty warm out in the -4 tides. We were right above the government ground where there were lots of clams and oysters and everything else. One day, Wally said, "Hey, let's go clam digging." So we had old sandy road that went down there. When you went to the beach, it was steep and sandy, and you came back up, you better not slow down. In that sand, you just get buried. But anyway, we went down one day, and dug a bunch of clams, you know, and not thinking anything about it. Well, the state forestry guy came out to check us that day.
Oh, gee.
And of course, the shovels, they probably weren't sharpened on the end. He was a retired military guy, Army guy or something. Anyway, we had we had 5-gallon buckets and a couple of water cans, and we had axes and shovels around there. And some of the stuff we had was in the back of the old panel we took down clam digging.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and we went down clam digging, and when we came back, he'd written a ticket
Oh.
for us, and he swore to his supervisor and to us that we knew he was coming, and we hid from him.
Wow.
He thought we literally thought we had taken off and hid from him, and when he was coming, so we wouldn't get in trouble, and he made us sharpen the shovels was his deal. The end of the shovels, he made us paint them.
Wow.
So they wouldn't rust, and paint the axes and sharpen the axes, and made sure we had enough. I hate to say we dumped the water out and used a bucket to get clams.
Yeah.
We were going to bring some more water, you know, but the day was going to be over
Yeah.
by the time we got back. But anyway, we were all he had to fight. I don't know if he went to court over that one or not, but he definitely fought. And I think they finally dropped the charges and stuff, or the ticket or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
so he didn't have to pay it. But what a, you know, that was an interesting time. And then we logged some. I logged with him for a while, and then he got that cant show over there at Worthington's up here by Hanson's Pond.
Oh, yeah.
And they were running skidder on that. And then we did that until we were, I think after that, had a logging job up on Mount Zion. And I run the skidder a little bit, but I cut quite a bit of it too. And me and the fly here are having a battle.
I see that. Yeah.
Go back over to you where
Yeah.
it belongs. But anyway, we logged up there, and somewhere in there, if I remember right, a job opened up with Irving Johnson. He needed a cutter. I went out and worked with Larry McClanahan out in Forks on a job. I think it was called Mosquito Creek or something out there, and it was kind of a flat job, swampy, and Larry didn't have anybody to work with him at the time, and I wasn't really experienced, so he'd fall some trees, and I'd buck what I could. He was running an 090, and I think I had a 1100 home light at the time, if I remember right. Yeah, and it was it didn't have a great compression, but it ran. It was what I had, and I think I ended up with an 870 or 950. I can't remember what was after that. That was newer and new one. But anyway, he cut and I bucked until that job was done. And I can't remember if it was for Snell's or who it was for. But then I got a job for Irving Johnson. Called him Gramps Johnson. And it was out he lived in Daybaugh, but he was working for Crown Z. He had just a cutter and a skidder that worked for Crown Z. And we did some logging out by Sandy Shore. We did some logging in different places. And that's kind of when Crown Z got into the export. Export started going about then. And Johnson and Gunstone let Crown Z log a lot of their land up behind Discovery Bay.
Okay.
And so we were cutting up there on the hill. And it was the first time I was ever approached by someone in the union. A guy drove up in a dark green Buick Electra. He had a short cigar in his mouth, never got out of the car, and there was another guy right down below us. I don't know if it's Ed Udd. I can't remember who was logging below us, but then we were logging up the hill a little bit farther. And he said, well, I was just down talking to some other guys. Are you guys interested in being in the union? And me and George Tyner was running. In fact, he had a Garrett 15. Kept it pretty good and ran pretty good for the wood we were yarding. And if I remember right, Woodley hauled the wood. We just had to stack it up and first time I ever heard the word cunit. But they would measure the cunits. It came out pretty close to what he hauled. But anyway,
Wow.
stacked them up, and Woodley would haul them out. But that guy drove up and he said, "Hey, do you guys want to be a part of the union?" I said, "What are the benefits?" And George and I did, and he said, "Well, we pay like $5.70 an hour. You have to pay so much to the union for representing you and whatever." And I said, "Well, we get a lot more than that right now for cutting timber." And he said, "Oh." And he said, "You guys aren't interested?" And I said, "We'd have to take a cut and pay, and then give the union some money," you know. And he looked at me and said, "Well, that's what the guy down below said too." And he said, "Okay, I just thought I'd ask." And he drove off, never got out of the car,
Wow.
never nothing. And so anyway, that was my union experience. Anyway, I cut there for quite a while, but Irvin, he was older, and it was just harder to get jobs. And Crown Z was kind of going a different direction. And eventually, after a while, they finally shut down. But somewhere in there, I can't remember if I was working for Wally again, cutting somewhere for him. I think we logged up at Clay Banks. My grandma had a piece of property up behind the fish hatchery. We logged just down by the river a little bit up there. And I just cut it and yarded it myself. And Wally had that. And then I saw J.R. Bloomfield one night, and he said, "Hey, do you want a job cutting?" And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, we're logging up towards Forks." It was up Hunger Mountain Road. He said, "We're logging up there, and Misty is deer hunting right now. He's going to be hunting for a couple of weeks. I need someone to cut." By that time, I was running 050s and 051s stills. And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I'll pick you up in the morning, whatever," and drove up there. And I ended up cutting with JR and Misty together for over 5 years. And then JR left. He was going to go fishing and do some tribal things. So Misty and I cut for 2 or 3 more years together. And I started getting my own right-of-way jobs and some other contracts and logging. But during that time, I just started blowing discs out in my back.
Oh.
And I have no idea why, and neither did the doctor. But once you blew one out, then pretty soon you blow another one out. And I remember being down there 1,500 feet from the pickup cutting in the mountains. And I liked cutting, and we were cutting for Ray Buckman, and he had a contract with the plywood mills, which meant we got the bigger wood. And we had, at that time, there was a lot of hemlock and white fir up in there, and there was some fir once in a while on a ridge, but they were all 3, 4, 5 foot, 5 foot trees, and it was nice to cut them. But I might be reaching out, bucking one or whatever, and just all of a sudden, boy, I just go to my knee. And I go to the chiropractor, found an old chiropractor up in Port Angeles. I could walk in there, or I could get carried in there, and I could walk back out.
Wow.
And I thought that's good enough if I do that, and I rest for a day or two in the weekend and go back at it again. Unfortunately, that didn't cure the problem. Just kept blowing them out. But I cut for them for 5, 7, 8 or 9 years, and then I had some of my cut for myself. I cut for other people, and finally I went to the doctor, and he said, "If you don't quit this, you're going to end up in a wheelchair."
Ooh.
Sent me to a specialist over in Seattle, 2 specialists, and they looked at me, and about 5 years before that, I went to a doctor, and I saw a specialist in Port Townsend. Nice guy, but he told me, he said, "You got something's wrong with the lower back a little bit, but you're okay, just go back to work." And so I went back to work. 5 years later, almost to the day, I went to the doctors over at the specialists over in Seattle, and they said, man, if you'd have been here 5 years ago, we could have helped you. But your discs are all narrowed. You just got a disc of you got a back of an 80 or 60, 65-year-old man. Difference is, he took me out to his 4-story window and looked down the back up there in Seattle out of the Swedish hospital. He said, you know, see these people down here? There's some people that are 60, 65 years old. Your back are narrow. People's backs are narrow. Your trouble is with yours, you got injuries in your neck and your lower back too. And I said, what did that come from? I don't know. He said, but it did. And so I started running loader. I went to work for Mankey's. Terry Corey got me a job. I liked working with Terry. You know, he got me a job, and for Mankey's, and pretty soon I was practicing on the loader. Pretty soon I was running the loader most of the time. Apprentice 600B, and I liked running a loader if it was busy, but if it wasn't busy, talk about boring. I'd get out and file chains, and sometimes I'd get on another skidder, and you know, sometimes we just Terry and I, sometimes some jobs we just have a skidder. We take turns cutting and running skidder and get up there and buck on the landing and load, and we get a load or two a day, you know, that way. And other times we had 2 740 John Deere skidders, guys running them, and we get quite a bit of wood with those.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, we got probably as much wood or more wood than sometimes the high lead side did that were running that little Washington Skylock.
Okay.
You know, we get quite a bit of wood. In fact, down at Fort Lewis, we were loading out 12, 14 loads a day, and a lot had a lot of defect in it, so a lot of it didn't get loaded out. But anyway, yeah, we logged a lot of wood with those, and one had grapples, big wide tires and grapples, and the other one had smaller tires but chokers, and the smaller one was faster. Terry out at Yelm one time, we were logging out in Yelm, I think he had a D8 Cat, and they put a shear blade on the back, and Terry was running that. Well, we were about half a mile out in the corner of a 40-acre patch out there, and he dropped the blade, and he made a freeway all the way to the landing.
Yeah.
And once in a while, you know, I'd be buckling the landing, running loader, running the skidder or whatever, and I'd jump on and we'd go out there, and I'd get the one with the chokers, because you had shear, you had piles, so you could run around, you grab a pile and grab a pile, and we had I think we had maybe 20-foot or 30-foot chokers on it.
Oh, wow.
And we could wrap it around the whole pile, and you could pull whatever you could pull in those things. You had 8 gears ahead.
Wow.
And you grab them, and if you're fortunate, the one with the grapples would have 1 or 2 of those, and you have the chokers, but you know you were going to outrun him. If you got to the road faster, you'd race him, and he'd eat the dust behind.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, we've learned to have fun and still get wood in, and it's a brushy kind of hem. There's some fir and hemlock mostly there, and there was at that time something called a Korean piling, and they had from 19 feet to 41 feet, funny in lengths, 41 feet long, and they could only be so big on one end, like 6 or 8 inches on one end and 4 inches on the other end for the piling, and it was so hard to make the piling out in the woods because of the lemmy stuff. Finally, Chuck Mankey came out and he said, you know, why don't you guys just take those and put them on the truck, and from the nose of the truck to the end, it can only be 65 feet long. Go out there and give it a haircut and send it to the landing. We'll make it down at the dump, I think, down there. I think they took it to Shelton, maybe, I'm not sure. So when they opened those up down there, you got them and you stuck them on the truck, and you went around and you cut all the limbs off the outside. It looked good, and back you go measure we knew what it was from the back stake on, just cut it off and send it to the landing. When they opened those up, Boy, it looked like a mess.
Wow, and they would process everything down there at their
And they
yard.
did. They processed it down at the yard because out in the woods we had the 2 skidders, and I think we just had one guy on the landing. I think Terry and I and maybe Joe Mankey and a couple. I don't know which ones of us were running skidder or not running skidder. And the Terry had time he'd go out and with that shear and with the cat, and he'd shear a bunch of it, and
Yeah.
sticking it out. There was quite a ways out there, so he'd shear a bunch and probably get on the landing or on the shovel or whatever it was. But yeah, it was, you try to measure, you got 19 feet, 23 feet,
Yeah.
27 feet, 34 feet, up to 41 feet if I remember right.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. But anyway, it was easier to lay them out there in the landing. And I don't know if they knew the limbs were coming in like Chuck.
Oh, yeah, right.
Chuck did, but I don't know if anybody else did or not. But
Wow.
but anyway, I started working for them, and we moved a lot of wood.
Did you work with Randy Corey?
Yeah,
out there too?
Randy and Harpo,
Oh, Scott Loring.
Scott Loring,
Yeah.
they were chasers, and they worked good. They were good workers. I enjoyed working with them.
How long did Randy and Harpo work with you, or did you work with them down there?
Oh, see, I must have worked with Harpo and Randy on the landing. I must have worked with them probably I don't remember when they came on. 3, 4 years, something like that maybe. I know they weren't in Yelm. I'm kind of remembering. I think we had the 2 skidders there on Fort Lewis. They might have come to work then. I know they worked for us. We logged. Mankey's bought what 440s I think from Zula Kelly. Walt Kelly had up there on Mount Walker, and we logged that. And they were logging. They were chasing the landing there.
Okay.
And logging there. And I can't remember. Time flies by. I can't remember. We worked together for quite a while, and those 2 guys were good workers. We got along good and worked good and stuff. So, I never had any problem with them. Hopefully, he didn't have any problem with me either. But Mankeys were pretty good. They treated me really well. And I asked them. We had some jobs, especially the ones we had at Fort Lewis and stuff for different reasons. I asked them if they could weld some extra pieces on the end of my grapples that I was loading logs with, because I could reach in and dig them out, or I could bust some, or I could do different things. But I also could open them up enough that a small log wouldn't go through it. And I could grab the top of it and I could just strip it down and get a lot of the limbs off, so the guys weren't having to cut long limbs, and then I could just throw it out there, they could get at it. And with the skidders, they pulled the skidders and pull it in, and 2 skidders would come in, one would drop it, the other one would come in and drop it, the last one would turn around and butt the ends up. And they'd each have a tape measure, they'd measure them out there and stuff. But if there was some that are really, really limby, I could grab one at a time and strip it out and throw it out of the way and strip it out, and it really worked pretty good. It was, I guess not everybody gets to do that, but we didn't have any other things that stripped it, but that shovel did, and you could cut a load of firewood with that grapples. Somebody would cut them off. I just pick them up and pop, and set them there and get a load and pick it up and set them to pick up.
Wow.
Yeah, we did a lot of both, but we got a lot of wood.
Now, did you ever get to run this? And I've seen it once when I was a little kid. Terry had an idea for a Truckman log loader that had some type of air-operated, I think it was a saw. There was a saw in there, and you could strip the limbs off of it. It was like a real crude processor.
Huh?
Do you remember anything about that?
No.
He had this thing in the field out there by his in-laws, and it was, I had heard that Mankeys gave it to him when he retired, but I was curious if you were ever around that thing.
Well, they could, Chuck Mankey was pretty good, pretty sharp. Him and some other people, but he would do a lot of things and make a lot of things work. And I'll tell you, if there's one thing that I didn't like to do, that's work on equipment.
Oh yeah.
I could, but I didn't like it. But I could run equipment pretty hard, but take care of it. I didn't tear things up. I hated to have something go wrong. It was enough to grease things, fix a hose once in a while.
Yeah.
In fact, I was working on, my brother and I were working on one of our tractors over at my mom's, and I had diesel running down my elbows, and this is horrible. And I remember my logging days running equipment and stuff, and that was pretty common, hydraulic oil and diesel. But anyway, yeah, I didn't like the mechanics, so I could keep the loader running pretty good. I had a 1-ton pickup with fuel tanks in the back, and had hydraulic oil, everything we needed, plus because the grapples were there and we had chains, if we needed something from Mankey's from the shop, they'd bring out, like Fridays, a lot of times on Fridays or every other Fridays, we'd change oil.
Oh, okay.
And they just bring a barrel of oil. They just load a barrel of oil on the back of the truck and put their trailer on and bring it out and take their trailer off and take the barrel of oil off, and had a pump, and we just pumped, and we'd get over out of the way and drop the belly pans and
away you went.
Change the oil, and that was pretty good, and kept things greased and stuff. But I worked for them, and I remember, I think the last day I worked for them, they were kind of between jobs, and they said, hey, can you take a day or two off? We got some, and come in the shop and help us work on your shovel. I think it had a 300 Cummings in it or whatever. It was good. The only thing we ever did is they had a leak in the radiator one time, and then they changed the head. It was used a little bit of oil, so they changed the head on it. But other than that, that thing ran all the time. But they didn't have kind of had paperwork to get a job done or whatever. So I was in the shop working. I think Marvin was there at the time, and another guy, and was in there working. We were going to do some welding and monkeying around with my grapples, and they were laying on the cement floor. And that one day I got a bar, and they said, well, we got to get something over here to move this. I said, it should spin around. It's just sitting on the round hinge right there. It should spin around. I put the bar there, and I spun it around. Boy, I felt something kind of my lower back, but nothing hurt at the time. I didn't think anything about it, It wasn't anything new for me after blowing discs out. Anyway, the time I got home, I couldn't hardly walk. Got out of the pickup, I couldn't hardly walk, and my back was swollen up, and it felt like a fire back there. Oof. And that's when I need to go to the doctor, and boy, that was a tough one. I told Dana, my wife, I said, hey, I think I'm done working in the woods. I don't know this, and I got pretty teary-eyed. That wasn't something that you want to do. I had a family and whatever. And she said, "Yeah, right. You've been to the doctor lots of times, and you won't quit." And I said, "Yeah, I know. I won't. I don't want to." Mm-hmm. Anyway, I went to the doctor, and that's the first thing he said: if you don't get out of the woods, you're going to be in a wheelchair. And he said, we got to get an appointment. We can't get to see the specialist for about 2 or 3 weeks. My first words were, shall I go back and log again? Until he said, don't you understand? You're by these x-rays, and this is only an x-ray, you're in trouble. Your back's in trouble. And that ended my logging for Mankey's. It didn't end my logging. It should have, but I studied for the ministry. I was saved. We had a little daughter that was born with a hole in her heart, and her esophagus hooked to a windpipe. I wasn't saved until I saw that, and boy, I tell you, it brought me to my knees. And I asked Jesus into my life, and what a change it made. And Dana was in the hospital in University of Washington, had a little baby there. five and a half pounds. She's a couple months or a couple weeks early, 5 weeks premature or whatever. They took her over to the orthopedic hospital the next day and did surgery because that gas from her stomach would have destroyed her lungs. So they had to take that esophagus and windpipe and separate them. And how they did it, it was I think the esophagus or something, one of them was about the size of a lead in a pencil. The windpipe was about the size of a doctor's little finger, and they hooked them together without them leaking.
Wow.
I was amazed, and I started praying and wondering what was going on, and didn't know Jesus yet, but I tell you, I was praying, and it wasn't within a couple weeks or a month or so, I asked Jesus into my life. And it was, you know, when she was 11 months old, we took her in for open heart surgery, and I handed her to the doctor, knowing that if she made it, which she did, you know, I'd be grateful. If she didn't, I'd see her again one day. I didn't know that before that. Anyway, so I studied for the ministry and started preaching, started teaching Sunday school, had no idea what preaching was. And we were overseas. I was overseas in the Philippines for about a month, doing service with the team from back East Coast. Then my wife and I went over with another team over to Sweden and Western Europe, and we preached up and down Western Europe and did a lot of street ministry over there. And I came back, and a church opened up in a little town of Doty down in Lewis County, down by PL. In fact, the kids went to PL school down there, and first church I pastored, boy, nice old people, nice town to be in. Most of those people had been saved longer than I'd been alive, some of the old timers down there, and they just treated me and my family like royalty, you know, and good people. Kids went to school there, all but Jennifer and Ben graduated from PL. And after about 7-8 years, I knew it was about time to quit. My neck and back were really hurting then, and I just thought, you know, this is getting difficult. You don't make much money in a small church, but I loved it, you know, and our family were getting bigger, so I resigned, and come to find out the church in Quilcene didn't have a pastor. And to be honest, I tried to overlook it. I finally thought, you know what, I better send a resume. I just couldn't get away from it. I thought I was going to grow up and not come back to Quill. I was going to, you know, get out of the nest, and came back to Quilcene, and of all things, they hired me. But when I was down in Doty, you know, didn't have a lot of finances. There was a guy down there, Buck Thompson, he needed a cutter, and he heard that I'd cut, and so I went out and helped him finish cutting a job out at South Bend. And then other people heard about it, and I had some other jobs. And back up here, Don Newman had started a little logging outfit with a skidder, and so I cut for him, and I cut for Steve Val. Steve had a cat, and he did a little bit of logging, a lot of clearing, and we worked good together. He'd push a tree or two over and lay him out there, and I'd cut him off the stump and buck him and limb him, and he'd come back and pick him up. By that time, he had a couple more laying there, and it wasn't like going up and down steep mountains and stuff, and jarring my back and whatever, and that worked pretty good. But even then, I was having a harder and harder time working them because of the pain. So I started eating anti-inflammatory pills, you know, and I didn't think there was anything wrong with them. And I'd drink a little bit of coffee or Pepsi and take one of those in the morning and one at noon and one in the afternoon, and pretty soon I was burping and burning my whole esophagus and throat. And it got so after a while, if I took one, I'd end up breaking out in my throat and mouth and break out in sores, so I became allergic to them for some reason. I did something,
Wow.
so I can't take them to this day. Even ibuprofen and that, it just hurts my kidneys and stuff. It just wasn't the right way to live, but I was supporting my family. But then I came back to Quilcene and pastored the church and started working over in Coyle for a guy who had a sawmill and had a like 70-acre farm. Him and his wife, she had some very nice horses. And Don and Mariana Avery. Little did I know that, well, Don Avery, he retired from Brown University. He graduated from MIT as a metallurgist in engineering and science. And he had married a lady by the name of Mariana Pinchot. And come to find out, Mariana Pinchot's grandfather started the National Forest, grew up with the Rockefellers. So, and I met all of her brothers, Peter and Gifford III.
Wow.
Nice family and stuff.
Wow.
But yeah, he had a sawmill and she had beautiful horses. She had some Welsh Cobbs and she ended up with some Lusitanos and very expensive horses. They didn't act like they were wealthy, but they had trust funds that skipped generations and stuff. So, but anyway, a nice family, and I think I worked there for over 13 years till I finally retired. She fell off one of her horses and broke her neck and died. About 3 years later, Don had a spot. He started having problems, mental problems, and stumbling around and forgetting what was going on. And what really keyed in, one morning I got to work and the telephone rang at Don's house. I always stopped there to check on him. I knew he was going to the doctor, but I just checked on. They had a parrot and a couple dogs, and then I'd go out to the horses, and we had cows by that time, and I'd go out and check on them, but I always stop at the house and walked in the door and the phone rang, and it was a deputy sheriff from over in Kitsap County, and they said, "Are you Dan Ward?" And I said, "Yes." And boy, heart just sunk, and he said, "Do you know Don Avery?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Can you come over to the parking lot over at Walmart in Paulsbo? Don Avery's over here and he seems to be confused. He doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing." And he's driving around the parking lot and he doesn't, he hasn't done anything wrong or whatever. And so Nicole was working with us out there, helping with the horses at the time. My youngest son's his wife now. And not that you don't know that, but everybody else lives
nobody else does, yeah.
But we went over and picked him up. One of us drove him home, the other one drove his car home. Got him back home, and he said, "I was supposed to go to the doctor. Can you call him and tell him that I can't come in?" He said, "I don't know what happened." And that time he was lucid. We understood, he understood what was going on. He went to lay down upstairs, and we went out and took care of the horses and animals and stuff, and came back to see how he was doing. And, "You doing all right up there, Don?" And really, Nicole was really forceful. She said, "Do you all right?" And he said, "Yeah." Pretty soon we heard him fall. His bed was tall, and Don wasn't very tall. I made a step for him to step up in his bed. He tripped on that stool and ended up on the floor, bruising himself up. And I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "What happened? Did you knock something down?" He said, "No, for some reason I fell out of bed trying to get up." And anyway, Nicole said, you need to go to the hospital. You need to have the ambulance come." And he said, "You think so?" He said, "I think I'll be all right." And she was forceful. I was just kind of watching and praying and listening, and she said, you need to go." And once he said okay, I was on the phone immediately. 911, get the ambulance out here. And he went to Bremerton to the hospital. They were doing MRIs of him. Thought he was gallbladder, he just a few months before that, he had a bypass and a valve fixed in his heart. Thought maybe it was some infection from that. We had no idea, and they were checking it. Fortunately, when they were checking at one of the radiologists, the doctors happened to notice they were looking at his gallbladder and looking at some different things. They went back and looked again, and there was a little tiny spot on his liver. And come to find out, he had cancer in his liver. One spot. It wasn't the liver filtering cancer out. The cancer started in the liver, which is kind of unusual. Usually, it picks it up from the spleen or somewhere, and ends up with cancer and sends it out. But it was poisoning his system, and because it was poisoning his system, it was going to his brain and was poisoning his brain. So, what happened is he was just losing memory and stuff, and eventually 8 days later he was dead. He was gone that quick. And so, but I ran the sawmill out there. We had a couple of barns built. We built different places. You had a 30 by 60 shop. We put layers on it to stack boards and stack stuff, and put a library. And one thing about having your own sawmill, you have a pole building. There's nothing exactly the same, but if you have a sawmill and there's something, instead of having a 2x8, you need a 2x9.5. So you cut a 2x9.5 on one end and 2x8 on the other end to square things up and make a deck and stuff. But anyway, I was in the ministry. But when I was pastoring down in Doty, I met an interesting guy. I already mentioned it to you. It was Finley Hayes.
Yeah.
And I had the good fortune for a couple of years of being his pastor. He came all the way from Onalaska into Doty and went to church with us, and we took a tour around Oregon and southern Washington. Ended up over in Tacoma at the little logging place there at Point Defiance. That was our last deal. We went around taking pictures and interviewing people on steam engines. It was something and that was pretty good. And Don Avery later on had a boat from the Pinchos. Giver Pinchot II had built a boat, a launch, with a steam engine in it. And Don and I got it going in Pleasant Harbor. We drove it around. And I should have kept it. I could have had it, but I gave it back to the Pinchot family so that maybe they could put it in something back on the East Coast, some kind of a old thing. But anyway, my logging days were over. I still got some sawdust floating around there. I got to cut some wood once in a while and whatever. But
so now, when was it that Finley came out and did an interview with you for Loggers World? That would have been
just when I moved up to Quilcene after I left the church down there. In fact, he pastored there until his eyes got bad, or he came there when I was pastoring until his eyes got bad the last year or so, until he didn't want to drive that far anymore, which was understandable. But I kept in contact. We'd have coffee in town once a week, or he'd drive out once in a while and visit, or I'd go in there to his house and visit him and Jean and whatever. But when I moved to Quilcene, in fact, I can tell you when it was. It was probably May or June of '98.
Okay.
Because our phone number was 4198, and we moved to Quilcene and started past the church 40198. Just happened to be. That's the only reason why I can remember it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's too cool.
Yeah. So yeah, then he came up. He said, "I want to do an interview." So we came up and had lunch and drank some coffee and went to Mount Walker and had kind of an interview. It was an interesting interview, but you got to spend time with him.
That's too cool.
Yeah.
Dan, I'm kind of curious, jumping back in time here, the Misty Bloomfield days and J.R. Bloomfield days, you guys mainly worked high country, right?
Pretty much most of the time, although I was cutting some right-of-way and doing some other things. I know Misty was cutting this job for Bill Bolander right up the Big Quill, just where the pavement starts up here. Okay. Down over the hill, and he needed some extra work done, so between jobs, and I think just before elk season, I think I was going to go elk hunting with Terry or something that year, but I went up there and cut for him, and we did a job up in Port Angeles for a private guy that had, I think, 20 or 30 acres there. And we cut for him, and Bill Bolander. We started cutting for not only Ray Buckman, we started cutting for Bill Bolander too. We had two sites we cut for.
Mm-hmm.
And Misty hired another guy from up in Forks, up in Snyder, really, and he worked with us for a while. But most of our jobs were in the mountains. Most of the big wood we cut a couple, 2 or 3 units up. It's called Black Diamond up out of Port Angeles, up
Yeah.
Little River.
Mm-hmm.
We cut a couple jobs there, and a bunch of them up Hunger Mountain, Gunderson Flat. Probably the biggest tree I cut was on Gunderson Flat, and the ground was soft and mossy, but about as flat as this table. And in one day I cut a 9-foot spruce, fell a buck with a 42-inch bar and chain.
Wow.
I fell an 8-foot 2 or whatever it was, and a little over 7-foot spruce one day. I had a whole bunch of little hemlocks that were 3 log long. I guess they grew up after the 1923 blow. The old timers set up there. There was a big blowdown, but the spruce still stood. Tough old things, but cut them and a whole bunch of little ones one day, and I never took a picture of them.
Wow.
I just thought, you know what? Young, all this big wood, we'll be in it all the time.
Yeah.
We weren't.
Yeah, it didn't last that long.
And we didn't have cell phones where you went around, like you have a camera there. We did pack cameras around and stuff and whatever. But I was able to fall and bucket. It was flat enough to fall and bucket with a 42-inch bar. Yeah.
What do you think your scariest experience was out in the woods in all those years?
Scariest?
Mm-hmm.
I remember the one that really is memorable is I remember being up at a place called Hawks Haven up above Jefferson Lake. And they had built a road. In fact, I went up there in between jobs or not in between jobs, but Misty and we were getting ready to go out in the West End cut, and I had a few days, and there was someone building road up there at that unit. I went and cut some right-of-way for them. They took the right-of-way. A lot of times they instead of yards on the right-of-way, they took the right-of-way and they just push it off the road, hanging over your head, rocks. It's leaning against trees, and there was a bunch of dirt on one end of it, and the other end was leaning against one tree, one pretty good size. Oh, it's probably 2.5 foot hemlock leaning against it, and those aren't as sure of holding as a fir is, but you know, it didn't seem to be broke, but it was definitely leaning out and leaning where it needed to go to bucket. But here these trees were leaning against it. The only tree I had left up there. I had no place else to go or run and hide, and it was where it was at, it was hanging out, so you couldn't get on top of the logs and cut it tall. You had to cut it from underneath, and it was like being in a cave underneath there, all these logs hanging over you. And I remember cutting it, and even though I wasn't saved at the time, I remember very distinctly saying, Jesus, boy, I need your help on this one. It was, you know, and I was young, I was quick and fast, but I wasn't stupid. I knew how dangerous that was. But when it went, I was probably 50, 60 feet from it and still running.
Wow.
I probably dropped my saw somewhere along the way underneath something that wouldn't get hurt, and the logs didn't fall right away. They just kind of, dirt started coming down and rocks started falling down, and the tree went, and it kind of went slow and kind of like slow motion, and pretty soon down it went, and some of the other trees kind of came down and stuck in the ground, and everything kind of came to a halt. Wow. And I would have made it standing there or not, but I'm glad it was not. Wow. I remember how that was kind of a scary one. I cut some other ones under the right of way when you got up to the right of way. They hadn't logged them, and I'd cut some other ones, and some of them I had to leave tall. You know, around a landing where they had logs, you get on top of the deck of logs. Those were kind of scary too, especially if they leaned over the logs you were standing on. You had to get off of those if they're going to go, and not every tree goes exactly where the undercut is, especially if they've been pushed around a little bit, you know, with equipment and whatever. But there was some, but other than that, I don't remember anything really scary. I remember cutting some big trees up a place called Pistol Creek up Hunger Mountain there, and I remember bucking a log and reaching around. I had to reach out a long ways. I usually ran a 32-inch bar on my stills, and I reached around and I reached up underneath, and I knew it was going to pull away from me and go when it went. Anyway, I cut it under, and I cut it the other side the best I could reach it. And I remember grabbing a hold of rhododendrons, and it started going, and I remember taking my saw with it. I grabbed hold of the starter rope and the rhododendron and stretched out, and pretty soon my rope broke. The saw was going,
oh gosh.
I didn't even look for it. The logs had smashed it, you know. And but that wasn't so scary. It was just discouraging because you thought you had it taken care of. But,
yeah, it took it right down.
But for some reason, the bigger logs on steep ground, it was physically and mentally a challenge that I just loved. I don't know why. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the glory of it or whatever. It was just a challenge.
Yeah.
You know, and even though I blew discs out, I never really got hit with a log or anything. So I'm pretty fortunate.
What do you think the best job was that you worked on?
Well, I'll tell you what some of the best wood was down a little place called Goober Pond. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It was inward. The trees weren't big. They were fir, just about 90% fir. The toughest fir I'd ever seen. You could there was stumps and there was rocks up there. It was up a hill. It wasn't really steep up a hill. And then it kind of, well, we call it flat. It was still probably 20-30% grade up underneath some sheer rocks. But to us, that was pretty flat. You know, pretty flat ground, but you could fall, they were so tall and clean, you could fall 6, 8, 10 trees at a time that were 2 foot, 30 inches through, and you'd get sometimes 6 logs out of each of them.
Oh, wow.
34s, 32s, you know.
Wow.
Whatever. And yeah, you could cut a lot of trees. Misty told me one day, I think I had 37 trees in a little pocket. We were sitting there eating lunch. He says, hey, you cut those 37 trees, and they were all, you know, there was a few hemlock and some further. Cut those, we had a half a day to go. He said, cut those 37 trees and we'll go home. I said, okay. I had 2 left to buck, and JR busted his bar.
Oh.
And I said, oh, and we had a half an hour to go. All the trees were down. And you know, this kind of a game. I don't know what it was.
Yeah.
It was funny, but there were a lot of wood in those 37 trees. So I got 35 of them. All fell a buck. The other 2 laying out there ready to buck, and just taking me a few minutes to buck them because it's as clean as could be and whatever. But yeah, you could walk out, and that was my rest. You'd fall a bunch of trees, you'd take your saw out, and you'd buck one going out, maybe 2 going out, and then you stick your saw on the other one, then you go back and measure a bunch, and when you're walking back and forth, you weren't carrying your saw, but you were measuring trees, and that was your break. That or in the undercut and back cut of a tree, you know, the break. But you know, that's how you learn to rest.
Do you remember who logged that Goober Pond piece and how long ago that was?
Buckman logged it.
Okay.
Yeah, he logged that, and that must have been 75, 76.
Okay.
Yeah. See, I'm getting old. Doesn't seem that long ago to me, but boy, it is.
So was that would have been after Buck Mountain dissolved then? He
Yeah.
did his own thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever bump into a guy that worked with him, Rick Harris? You remember him?
Not by name.
Okay. Now, do you remember how long Ray Buckman carried on doing his own thing before he got out of logging?
You know what, I don't think it was very, very long after Misty and I cut for him. It seems like not too much longer. We were cutting a lot for Bill Bolander and some of Ray Buckman, but it seems like things were kind of tapering off for Ray Buckman about then. And whether he had very many jobs after that, I think the jobs up Hunger Mountain and Gunderson Flats, and there was up the A line. We cut a I'm laughing. Cut a job up the A line. It was pretty close to the road. I'm laughing because on top of the hill, Misty had something happen to his saw. And he came up the hill through the brush. He was cutting below me. It was pretty flat. I was cutting the guy line circle out up on top, and he was cutting down below, and just him and I there. And two interesting things happened. If I can go back to that, he came up through the brush and he hollered, "Hey, don't hit me!" And I was following him across, and he was coming up, and he wound up in through there, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, something broke on my saw. Something came loose. I needed to get a wrench or whatever." And he went to the pig and got a wrench. And he said, "Fall a tree down this ridge so I got something to walk on, would you?" And I said, "That ridge is full of stumps. I'll break it with hemlock, big hemlock. But if you fall them on a stump, they're gonna break every stump they hit." And he said, "Well," I said, "it's all brushy. I can't see them because I was following them, and over the stumps, the tops were all coming in from the side." And I said, "You can't even see where the stumps are." I said, "But I know that's full of stumps. There's stumps from there down to where there's trees." And he said, "Well, fall it anyway, we'll see." I fell it, and that's the worst tree I ever broke in my life.
Wow.
But it looked like an accordion. I said, "I wish you had your saw, you could buck those." There were 12 feet, 16 feet, 20 feet long.
Wow.
You should break.
Wow.
But anyway, and another thing that happened up there shortly later, it was pouring down rain and moss. There was moss on the ridge about a foot thick. It seemed like probably 6-8 inches thick, moss there. And I took my saw, and I thought, well, it was Friday, so I took my saw and I had a big undercut, a couple big undercuts there. So I grabbed them and threw them there and stuck my saw underneath them and just laid the undercut up kind of on the handlebars. The other end was up against a tree, and I laid it on top of that wet moss. Came back Monday, and it had frozen solid.
Wow.
My saw was frozen to the ground. It had 6 inches of sopping wet frozen moss stuck to the bottom of it. I had to chop it out of the ground, and I had to build a fire to melt the moss and water out from underneath it to even pull the crank to start
Wow.
it. And that was an experience I learned to be careful with too. Don't put your saw in wet moss and hope it's going to be wet when you come back instead of frozen.
Wow.
So yeah, experiences.
Too fun. And then now tell me about your dad. Did he work in the woods previous to working down at the log dump down here?
He worked in the woods a little bit. He was in World War II. Everybody, he didn't talk much about it. He was kind of disappointed that all the young people around Quilcene got together and they went to the recruiter's office and signed up to go in the service in World War II when it was going hot and heavy. He went there, but he had asthma. And at that time, they didn't take colorblind people. My dad was colorblind. I have 2 sons that are colorblind, a nephew that's colorblind, and also, but Dad was colorblind and had asthma, and so they put an X on him and said,
Really?
out of here, and so he went to Indian Island and worked in the munitions depot until down in Port Chicago, down in Vallejo, California. They had a munitions place down there too, and they evidently dropped some napalm bombs fooling around or whatever. And Dad said they rolled the railroad tracks, the little narrow gauge railroad tracks, up a half a mile up to the office buildings and stuff from the ships, and they asked for volunteers from Indian Island. So he went down there, and when he came back to Olympia, and for some reason he thought he could start a cleaning business, which he did. He had a successful cleaning business. But my grandpa Noah Johnston, my mom's dad, encouraged him to come back and go to work with him logging.
Mm-hmm.
My grandpa had a logging company, and so he came back and logged with him, and they were dumping logs right here at the head of the bay. I got pictures of the log boom down there, but log rafts that my grandpa had somewhere downstairs. And anyway, and he started rafting logs. Dad was very sure-footed, quick on his feet and stuff. He wasn't big, 5'9", 150 pounds or whatever, and he could figure out rafting logs and putting them where they belong in the pockets and sorting them or whatever. He was good. He was good at that, and he liked that. So if there wasn't anything else to do, he'd log. I think he worked with Walt and Harold Peterson, Wally Peterson's dad and uncle, for a little while, and they were logging, I think, out at the end of East Quill out here, and there was a bunch of fur blowdowns from a long time ago, and I remember him talking about taking an axe, and they'd go out with the cat, and they'd sound these trees to see what they sound like. He'd tell if it was rotten or not, and they'd buck them off and yard them in. But every chance he got, he started doing boom work, so he rafted logs over here at East Quill for a while. He rafted logs quite a bit in Pleasant Harbor. That's where when I was a kid in high school, we did a lot of our growing up down in Pleasant Harbor, fishing and swimming and rolling on logs, because all the logs were put in at that time were all single. They weren't bundled yet.
Oh.
And so single log, and he'd go skipping across them. It was kind of interesting. Of course, he had cork boots on. We were barefooted or tennis shoes or whatever. We could usually stay up on them, but yeah, he had to. But he was good at it, and then he rafted logs down towards Linger Longer there at the old mill pond, we call it. They have kind of a park there now with some gravel on the beach. He rafted logs until he started rafting them over here in East Quill again, and him and Jim Shaw contracted for, I think there was several, in fact, some of our logs from around this area that I cut came in here, but I think there was North Cascade Plywood, Everett Plywood, Publishers, Seaboard, Pope and Talbot. There may have been another one too, but they were all hauling in there. And Pope and Talbot ended up with the log dump. And Dad worked there till he was 65, retirement age. When he retired, Pope and Talbot shut it down. Wow. And just kind of good. But he did he rafted logs in East Quill. A lot of them were Pope wood from up in the mountains here too, and some Seaboard and Publishers and plywood mills too, but a lot of them for those. So, and then he got a cat. Him and my brother logged little pieces here and there after when he was 65, when he had time to do other things. So, but yeah, he logged a little bit. His dad logged a little bit, but with horses.
Wow.
And my grandpa's on the left, Noah Johnston, and his brother Leonard Johnston. Okay. Leonard had the log dump and that property up there in Blinn.
Okay, and where are these pictures taken at?
This, you know what? I really don't know. This is their spar tree, though, naturally.
Wow. And that's the old best coming into the landing.
Yeah.
Now that I got a picture off the computer, so you said this is?
This is my great-grandpa Cicero Johnston. This is my grandpa Noah. and this is Bob Johnston. And I'm not sure which one of the brothers is. This is one of their brothers, and this is Leonard Johnson. I think I mentioned to you before that spot going down by Spencer Creek.
Mm-hmm.
There you go over the Mount Walker Pass, and down the other side there's a flat back there, and then the steep hills, that was full of cedar logs. And his dad, Earl Ward, was always good with horses. His grandpa ran horses back in Valentine, Nebraska for the stagecoach.
Okay.
You know, way back there. And my grandpa was the oldest grandson, so he took my great-grandpa took my grandpa under his wings, and they learned a lot about horses, training horses and riding horses and pulling horses, stagecoaches and whatever. And so my grandpa was out here. He had a pack team, and he'd pack people in the mountains, but there was a guy that had a really nice team of horses. And he was trying to log cedar out of that. They were at the end, before you drop over the hill, that wide spot there, they had a place where they were splitting, you know, cutting shake bolts there, and then they'd send them down into the mills or whatever. But anyway, the guy couldn't get his horses to log, and he asked my grandpa. He knew he was good with horses and had horses and mules. He liked mules a lot, but asked him to go up there. Grandpa went up and looked at him. He said, "Boy, these are nice horses. They should be able to work." And lo and behold, my grandpa, before the day was over, he had them pulling logs, and he used one guy's horses, used him to yard that whole flat of cedar out.
Wow.
And other than that, I don't know if my grandpa logged much more than that, but he worked for the state forestry over in Center. My mom's dad, their family came from Oklahoma, probably the dust storm times, and they came up here and started logging as a family. And there was Bob Johnson, who lived down there in the Ducklebush, one of your neighbors. There was Leonard Johnson, who owned the log dump at Glen when it was there, and that property, all around that property there that the tribe has now.
Okay.
And there was my grandpa, Noah Johnston. They all worked together, and then eventually, I think when things were tough or when it got better, one or the other, they kind of split up and had their own job. I know my Uncle Leonard, he did a lot of logging up out of Blen, clear up in the Snow Creek area, Trapper Creek area and stuff. He logged a lot up in there. A lot of high lead logging in there. And my grandpa, he did high lead log, but he also had a couple of cats. He had that old 23 Bess that's still sitting on my mom's house, and he had a old D7, and it had the old cable blade on it and stuff. And he did a lot of logging with that. And he also had an old skid with, I don't know what engine was on it. We used to play on it when we were kids, big old. It was sitting in the air there at his house with big old logs to skid on for yarding. He had a rigged trees, and I remember he had we called it the gin pole. He had a gin pole set up in his house, dug in the ground in the corner of his property, his kitty corner right across from where our church is, the Assembly Church is, off of Washington Street now, kind of between Washington Street and the bank. Bank back in that area. There's a house there, and he had a couple garages, but he had a gin pole there, and we never watched him lifting, but he could take his cat and he could hook onto something if he needed to load it or whatever. He had an old air compressor, steel tires with that hard rubber in the middle. He had that running. He had his 1923 Best Cat running. He had a 1924 Kenworth, and he got crushed. He had a stump come down and bury him after the Columbus Day storm the next year, or whatever it was, or that year. He had a 40 acres up out of Lake Leland.
Okay.
And he was up there working by himself. Cat was sitting there idling away, and he cut a cedar off. So he cut a bunch of stuff off the firs he'd bucked, and he really wasn't a timber cutter or whatever. He was just choker setter, cat runner, good on equipment. But he was underneath there. I don't know what he was doing, reaching over and cutting a cedar off that was across it, and the stump came down and buried him. And,
Oh gosh.
yeah, and I remember going up there. I think I was looking for him. I think Larry McClanahan found him. Larry or Ernie McClanahan saw his hard hat shining down there in November, weather pouring down rain. I remember when I was a junior in high school. But anyway, he had equipment around there. I got in. We could not get the tire off that 24 Kenworth truck, and he still had an old trailer with a wood reacher sitting off the side, not hooked on it.
Wow.
But there wasn't any doors on old 24 Kenworth. It had old spring seats without anything on it but springs, kind of. And we couldn't get the tire off. The tire was flat, and that's when Buck Mountain was still going. Remember, Jack Renskers was over there working at Buck Mountain. And anyway, we got it started, and I don't know how old I was, probably senior in high school, just out of high school, whatever, and drove her down there. We'd pump the tire up and drive her back and park it and stuff. And yeah, he had that old best cat. In fact, that best cat was sitting up there at the community center. And if I remember right, Kenny Harris had the magneto that went to it, and Kenny got it started, and they poured a slab of cement, and he drove it up and parked it on that slab of cement at the time.
Well, what year was that?
Oh boy, that had to be early 70s maybe or
okay.
so. It was quite a while. You know, there used to be a plaque that went with it, and talked about Noah Johnson. He was one of the first founders of the Quilcene Volunteer Fire Department, and him and there were several guys that got it going. They needed a fire department and whatever, and kind of different little towns were finally getting them together and getting a volunteer fire department together, and he was one of the initial starters of that.
Wow. So that, so now Noah, when did he pass?
I believe in 63 or 4.
Okay.
Is when he was killed in the woods. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then when did that old best get retired from work? Would it have been late 60s then?
Well, I don't remember it ever working. It was there around the place, and my grandpa, he was a good mechanic. He liked to fool with things, and you know, that old air compressor sat around there for years. He hadn't used it for years, and he just tinkered with it. You know, he retired and tinkered with it, and you know, along with logging a little bit, and he got it running and had the best running. And his old D7 was running, and the 24 Kenworth was running. Everything he had, he kind of fooled around. It was running, and the only reason why he was really doing much logging at the time by himself is because of that Columbus Day storm. It had blown a bunch of stuff over.
Okay.
And so he's just up there cleaning that up and yarding it and getting a load or two here and there, and by himself and stuff. But yeah.
Now jumping way back here to just about the beginning of this interview, when you went and worked for Les Allen, did his family own that logging operation then?
His dad did, yeah, Bob Allen. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And who were they contracting for? Do you remember?
I have no idea. None whatsoever. I don't remember anybody coming up there. I just remember we were yarding up on the hill there.
Yeah. And do you recall how long they had that family operation going? I mean, I know there's Allen Brothers today, but...
Yeah, I have no idea. You'd have to ask Les, I guess, how long it went, you know.
Yeah.
I haven't seen him for 100 years.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and share some of your stories, and especially sharing with me your salvation story and how God brought you up out of the depths and redeemed you, and that you're still pastoring a church today.
fortunate. I'm very fortunate. Yeah.
And I guess I'll sign off and let you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.